Hello, good day, morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are watching from. Welcome to the latest of the Royal Institute of Philosophy's Expanding Horizons London Lecture Series. London lectures, but actually broadcast all over the world. And today we really have gone almost as far as you can get from London. You need to sort of really be a good frequent flyer to make this trip manageable. Fortunately, our speaker hasn't had to do it. Tamara Albertini is a professor and department chair at the University of Hawaiʻi at Manoa, which is really an extraordinary institution. As a department of philosophy, it has for a long time now been an absolute pioneer in comparative philosophy, way before other departments realised they ought to be getting in on the game. And it's extraordinary how many of the world's leading comparative philosophers, if you look into their CVs, how many of them are actually alumni of the centre, and if they're not, then they almost certainly spent a good deal of time there. So we're very, very happy to have Tamara here. Just to sort of give a little view of what we're going to do, we're going to hear Tamara's talk, and then we're going to have a discussion, and hopefully that discussion is going to include questions from you. If you'd like to ask your questions, all you need to do is to put them into the chat box, whether you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook. Two usual guidelines for those: please take a bit of time to phrase them so that they really are clear and it's a really sharp, well-formulated question. And secondly, make sure it's short enough to fit within the single chat box and doesn't flow over two or three. That really does help us this end. So for the moment then, we're just going to hear Tamara's talk. Her subject is mutual guardianship and hospitality, a moral obligation. So over to you, Tamara.
I would like to begin by thanking Dr. Julian Baggini for this gracious invitation. It is truly an honor to be invited to the Royal Institute of Philosophy, especially considering that that's where Bertrand Russell and so many more brilliant philosophers once lectured as well. I may not be at the Institute physically, but contemporary technology makes it possible for my voice and image to be hosted. Thank you again. I'd like to present some ideas I first developed during a research year that took me, among other countries, to Bulgaria, where I enjoyed a Fulbright scholarship in 2018-2019. At a conference there, I gave a talk entitled "Neither Clash Nor Dialogue, We Are Each Other's Guardians." A journalist in the audience became irritated and asked me, "What do you mean by neither nor? What else is there?" I answered that the explanation was in the subtitle, "We are each other's guardians." What I proposed was a third course, one resting on the notion of guardianship as an ethical concept. I have expanded my research since, and here is the outline for today's lecture. I'll start with going beyond intercultural dialogue. That will be a brief introduction, and then I'll proceed with guardian civilizations, the need for horizontality. This part will be more historic in nature, and then I'll move on to the next part entitled Ricoeur's hospitality, guest friendship, and Derridian hostipitality. This is the heart piece of my lecture, and then, as could be expected, there will be a conclusion. The notion of guardianship is neither present in Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilization, by now very well known text, nor among the very well-intentioned promoters of civilizational dialogue who approached UN organizations or gave addresses at the UN. There is the example of Austrian philosopher Hans Köchler, who in his letter to UNESCO spoke of the dialogue entre différentes civilisations and eventually received the UN's support in organizing a conference on intercultural dialogue. A famous UN address on the subject is the one delivered in 1998 by then Iranian President Mohammad Khatami and entitled "The Dialogue Among Civilizations." The idea was not without precedence in Iran. Suffice it to mention the organization by the same name, inspired by French Muslim philosopher Roger Garaudy, of which a branch was founded in Iran under the auspices of the Shah Banu, Iran's last empress. And there is the even earlier Safa Khaneh community, established by Haj Aqa Nurullah in Isfahan in 1902, which served as an interfaith center at a time when no such institutions existed in the West. These were all morally worthy and scholarly commendable initiatives. However, what I have in mind with the notion of guardianship is not a mere matter of intercultural or interreligious crossings. It goes beyond dialoguing and creating cultural or political alliances. The guardian assumes the moral responsibility not only for the continuing existence of other civilizations, but also for their thriving and flourishing. Essentially, the guardian provides a shared home. Historic examples of what I call guardian civilizations. The two examples are the classical Islamic period and the European Renaissance. What I mean by the Islamic civilization in its classical period is the period predating the destruction of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258. And the other civilization, the Renaissance one, is one of which I say that it meant to create something new. The plan was there, but it really was not implemented. Now, in different ways, both the Islamic civilization in its classical period and the one meant to be created in the Renaissance go back to the Platonic Academy. Not to its glorious beginning with a larger-than-life founder, we're talking about Plato here, but oddly to the Academy's end. In my experience, most people in academia cannot tell when Plato's school closed. They may know that it was founded in Athens in or around 387 BC, but not necessarily that it lasted, with some interruptions, till the 6th century AD, which is when Roman Emperor Justinian shut it down. And I'd like you to hear what Bertrand Russell had to say on the matter. At last, in AD 521, the academy was closed by Justinian because of his religious bigotry, and the Dark Ages descended upon Europe. In other words, the very Christian Justinian could not tolerate an institution that he viewed as a remnant of paganism. But then the question is, what happened to the last teachers and students of the academy? Where did they go? And you might be surprised to find out about the destination that they had. So some escaped to Haran, which today is in Turkey, others to Ctesiphon, the winter capital of the Sasanian Empire. A little more than a century later, both Haran and Ctesiphon were incorporated into the newly formed Islamic Empire. Haran became the center of translations of Greek scientific and philosophical works to Syriac and eventually to Arabic, while Ctesiphon was less lucky. It suffered irreversible decline after it was captured by Muslim Arab troops. Eventually, its palaces and monuments were used as building materials for a new capital. The new city was Baghdad, and it not only recycled bricks and marble, but also an ancient tradition of scholarship and sciences. Its famous house of wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah, thus served as a library, archive, academy, scientific complex, and translation center for Hellenistic, Persian, and Indian sources. It would be overstating matters to claim that the early Islamic Empire would not have become the repository of ancient knowledge without the migration of the last Platonists to ancient Persia. Obviously, one may never know with any precision how ideas travel, nor whether they will be received. Be that as it may, the Islamic world has been a guardian civilization for many centuries. It not only actively preserved the scientific sources of its predecessors, but also acknowledged its intellectual debt to other nations, especially Greeks and Persians. More importantly, it added substantially to the body of knowledge it inherited from previous civilizations. For a while, some Muslim philosophers and historians, coincidentally, many of whom were Shiites, even presented a chronology in which Greek and biblical traditions were intertwined, as if to say we are all connected. And this is what it looks like. Empedocles, King David, King Solomon, Luqman, followed by Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. In the correct historic sequence, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle follow pre-Socratics with no non-Greek figure inserted on their timeline. Also in Western sources, Empedocles is neither deemed the earliest nor one of the more prominent Greek philosophers. However, according to Kurdish physician and historian al-Shahrazuri, who collected the story from earlier Islamic texts, the great and divine philosopher, I quote, Empedocles, son of Ibn Nadir, born in Agrigento, was one of the greatest and principal sages in the judgment of all philosophers. After he had studied in Syria with David and Luqman, he returned to Greece and dedicated himself to the promotion of philosophy. It was also said that he studied with Solomon. In this view, Empedocles' fame is connected to his studies with King David and the latter's son Solomon, who preceded him by about 6 centuries. The third figure is Luqman, a Quranic personage after whom a chapter of the Islamic scripture is named. Later sources state that he was an African sold into slavery, but then released by a master who recognized his wisdom. On occasion, he is also referred to as a prophet. What is the making of this encounter between an ancient Greek, 2 biblical figures, and a Quranic personage? Since all its figures were said to be sages, the account was likely considered an allegory expressive of a worldview in which wisdom acted as the link between civilizations. In a different Islamic source, Empedocles is himself referred to as a prophet, using a term derived from Sufism, meaning Islamic mysticism, which makes him partake in a tradition that is obviously historically later. One cannot help noticing that this worldview places Islam between 2 older traditions, older than itself. Moreover, this worldview Islamicizes and appropriates historic figures who predate the event of Islam. Nevertheless, the Islamic Philosophia Perennis tradition does not point out any one tradition as the mother civilization. Wisdom has no beginning. In this understanding, the notion of a timeless wisdom is implicit. It pervades all cultures and forbids cultural arrogance and airs of superiority. And let us see now what happened centuries later in a very different location, in which another rediscovery of Plato took place. The city where it began was Florence, and the time was the Renaissance. I will focus on one philosopher only. His name was Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. A fresco by Cosimo Rosselli depicts him with Leon Battista Alberti to the left and Angelo Poliziano to the right. All 3 were members of the Platonic Academy, headed by Marsilio Ficino, which was first sponsored by the famous Cosimo dei Medici and then by his even more famous grandson Lorenzo il Magnifico. What artist and art theoretician Alberti, Pico the philosopher, and Poliziano, the Aristotelian and poet, had in common was humanism, a teaching that focused on human beings, their true potential, and how to call for the highest possible performance. It will make it easier for you to follow. So I was saying about humanism and how it was introduced to educate for the highest possible human performance, what the Greeks called the arete, translatable as both the excellence and virtue of generic man. Unlike Alberti and Poliziano, however, Pico tapped into all civilizations known to the Renaissance. And you'll see the long list. You'll find there a Byzantine and pagan philosopher, very rare in those days, Gemistus Plato. He joined Emperor John VIII on his trip to Italy in hope of achieving the unity between the Eastern and Western churches. And then you see Nicholas of Cusa, arguably the first Renaissance philosopher and the chief papal diplomat who helped to prepare the council. And then Florentine philosopher Marsilio Ficino, I just had mentioned him earlier. He translated the entire Platonic corpus, numerous Neoplatonic sources, and also the rare Chaldaic oracles and the hymns of Zoroaster, all from Greek manuscripts. And then finally, thanks to his tutor Elia del Medigo a Jewish scholar, Pico also became the first known Christian philosopher acquainted with the Kabbalah. And then also Muslim Andalusian philosopher Abu Bakr ibn Tufayl. I know I keep feeding you all these materials, but bear with me. Pico was most likely the first one to know about both Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and this source from Andalusia. What was his motivation behind his relentless efforts to study one philosophical tradition after another? It was driven by the conviction that philosophy dwelled in all world civilizations. One only needed to find the corresponding pieces in each to reconstruct it. Pico's answer to the question about human excellence is that one has to explore all world traditions to find the path of self-achievement. And we move on to a different slide. This is the one that lists for you all the traditions that Pico explored. And it is rather remarkable, not just in those days, but today as well. And I think the last one that I added here is the Islamic tradition and Kabbalah, of course. Here is the slide that gives you a little bit more background here, the Greek notion of arete, that is translatable as both excellence and virtue. And Pico's answer very clearly, you need to know all world civilizations to achieve yourself. That for him was the kernel of humanism. Now we can take a step back and say, well, it's a beautiful vision, but we might also question it. How beautiful is the vision in the end? It's a philosophia perennis in the Islamic tradition, or pia philosophia, the way how Pico put it. Well, grandiose, admirable, and definitely inspiring. However, let us face it, it is one thing to think ourselves the heirs of previous civilizations, which is a way of basking in the light of their achievements, and another to embrace, not accept or merely tolerate, embrace the coexistence with parallel civilizations. While the vertical axis aligns us with the past and lets us play the convenient role of recipients and keepers of heritage, the horizontal axis connects us to contemporaneous civilizations and implicitly to their and our future. It is the horizontal axis that presents us with the opportunity to become true guardians and tests how earnest we are in our desire to not only act as heritage keepers, but to provide a home for civilizations, a home other than our own, without depriving them of theirs. Heritage keepers are well-meaning and guardians too. It is, however, much harder to identify guardians on the horizontal axis. I shall try to offer a better understanding of this type of guardians by correlating the relationship of guardianship and hospitality. So I'd like to take a good look at these two notions. And let's see, what do I have next in my slides? Right, I'm preparing you here for the new bit: hospitality, guest friendship, and hostipitality. And I call this an open conversation with Ricoeur and Derrida. In many ways, every culture, every civilization that has been in contact with other traditions and populations is a host or has become one, at least for some period. I'm not just talking about offering sanctuary, as when the Persians welcomed the last Athenian Platonist, you heard the story, or to mention a very different event when India opened its borders to the Zoroastrians. You would know them as the Parsis. The Zoroastrians were fleeing Islam. There is a generosity that goes beyond offering shelter and securing survival. French philosopher Paul Ricoeur spoke of linguistic hospitality in the context of translations and correctly identified the ethical dimension of the task. I'd like you to see one quotation. Right, this is the one about heritage keeper guardians and host guardians. And this is fairly clear. It would include you and me too, by the way. And this is where I like to move on next. According to Ricoeur, translators ought to be hospitable. This is really the term he uses, meaning they are to find a new home for the words in the text they endeavor to express in another language. The effort is one of mediation between the terms in the original text and the ones in the receiving language. Not every shade of meaning transfers. There always remains a unique kernel that may not be detached from the language of origin. The art of translating consists in neither entirely absorbing the hosted language nor surrendering to it. Both are very important. Not to absorb entirely the hosted language and also not to surrender to it. Naturally, Ricoeur had more ambitious plans than reflecting on the translation of text. Ultimately, as the quotation on the slide suggests, he was thinking of cultural translations. For the purposes of this lecture, I would like to retain the notion of linguistic hospitality. For a more fundamental type of hosting, I'm thinking of a hosting of words, terms, and concepts across languages and cultures, which does not involve a translation process, not one that goes from one natural language to another natural language. But let me tell you first about a negative example. On occasion, this is rare, but on occasion, there is a country that refuses to give linguistic hospitality and even purges itself deliberately of any trace betraying the presence or even influence of another language. In the 17th century, the Académie Française, for instance, cleansed a formerly hospitable French of Provençal and Italian vocabulary. Provençal is the south of France today. That came not only from sister languages, but also from sister civilizations. Needless to state that this happened at the expense of the expressivity of French, the language that declined being a host and became, to use Descartes' terms, clear and distinct, ended up impoverishing itself. As is widely known, the more recent efforts to rid French of English words have so far failed. This is very different from, let's say, Turkish, that abounds to this day with Arabic, Persian, and Italian words, and from any language spoken in an area where different populations interact over a longer period. Thus, European languages, and not only, host hundreds of scientific Arabic terms, which are a reminder of an earlier historic time when Muslims excelled in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, chemistry, and many more study fields. The terms on the slide are typically called loanwords, as if they were going to be returned one day. If anything, they are on permanent loan. However, if the receiving language is the host, doesn't that make the language of origin the guest? Let us examine next what the notion of hospitality adds to one's appreciation of words like algebra, almanac, and cipher, all coming from Arabic. Linguistic hospitality ensures that no aggressive takeover occurs, right? You don't pretend that you do not know that these terms came from somewhere else. Actually, these terms continue to exist in their language of origin, where they're likely to undergo semantic shifts over time, but they also gain a home in other languages, English, French, Spanish, and so forth. In my view, the concept that applies here is one of guest friendship, a term that in English translates the Greek xenia. Xenos means stranger, foreigner, and friend. How can strangers be your friends? The answer is simple. They become your friends if you treat them as such. Ancient Greek literature is filled with examples of good and bad guest friendship. As a matter of fact, as I was preparing for today's lecture, I realized that one could read the entire Iliad as a manual of hospitality, with do's and don'ts embodied in individual stories. For instance, Telemachus and Nausicaa are exemplars of ancient Greek hospitality. The former treats Athena as an honored guest, not knowing her divine status, and the latter offers protection to naked and stranded Odysseus without suspecting his fame and royal standing. According to the etiquette of ancient Greek culture, one was indeed only permitted to ask the guest's name after attending to their basic needs. True hospitality is gratuitous and does not expect or hope for anything in return. One should note, however, that there existed a ritualized form of guest friendship, of xenia, whereby hospitality was reciprocal and cultivated among social equals. It was also hereditary between well-to-do families living in different Greek cities. But the examples of Telemachus and Nausicaa exemplify an ethics of hospitality that is entirely selfless and spontaneous. This ethics exists in many more cultures. Suffice it to mention Arab guest friendship that has actually risen to the level of an art form and survives to this day, and not only among Bedouins. Karam, the Arabic term for hospitality, also means generosity and is a clear indication of the ethical standard hosts abide by, even if it should be at the detriment of their family's well-being. There is also an aesthetical dimension implied in Karam's additional meanings of nobility and grace. It's time to come back to the 20th century. In 20th century Western culture, one needs to turn to Jacques Derrida to find an equally uncompromising mindset of the host. And let me share again a quotation with you. Some scholars, including Ricoeur, find it an impossible ideal to apply in practice. I quote, "Let us say yes to whom or what turns up before any determination or anticipation, whether or not it is to do with a foreigner, an immigrant, an uninvited guest, or an unexpected visitor, whether or not the arrival is a citizen of another country, a human animal or divine creature, a living or dead thing, male or female." End of the quotation. The arrival, or as Derrida puts it, the arrivant, meaning the arriving, the one in the process of arriving, has not been invited, which would give the host the opportunity to prepare the beginning, and let's face it, the end of hospitality. Other than invitation, visitation brings out one's true hospitable nature. Nevertheless, even there where the host opens up genuinely to the unexpected visitor, Derrida's concern is that guests are not to be overwhelmed by the host's hold to the point of always being reminded of their status as guests. Derrida points out that one cannot be in the position of the host without implicitly saying, "This is mine. I am at home." Another problem that I see may arise from being treated as a friend or a quasi-relative, and is the expectation that the guest adapt or even assimilate to the ways of the household. This would betray a mindset that says, "My home, my rules." True guest friendship, however, ensures that guests feel welcome in a home far from home. Not only does it allow them, but it actively encourages them to remain xenoi, which, if you remember, means both strangers and friends. As with guest words, you should know that the guest in your home belongs to two worlds. Derrida was aware of how rigorous his notion of unconditional hospitality was, and that hospitality always includes some form of hostility, whether it is the need to overcome one's inner resistance or the urge to translate the guest's strangeness in terms of one's own culture. He therefore coined the term hostipitality, thereby ingeniously emphasizing host as the root common to both hospitality and hostility. On one hand, the purity of Derrida's ideal of hospitality is the gold standard to keep in mind for everyone seriously considering being a true host. On the other, its unconditionality is an impediment to implementing the ideal. A way out of the difficulty is not to think in terms of two, but three. Rather than focus on host and guest, which implies a certain degree of inequality between the two, one should shift one's attention to the notion of guest friendship as the mediating factor. While Ricoeur suggested a hospitable translator as the intermediate, which puts the burden on only one of the players, I like to use a dynamic Hegelian structure to ensure a built-in process of mediation. In Hegel's famous Lord and bondsman dialectic, the emphasis is not on the opposites, Lord, bondsman, but on a unity that's separated into two. And that unity for Hegel is self-consciousness. So according to him, you have to start with the middle, self-consciousness, and then understand how opposites were generated, rather than going from opposites to a unity. If we substitute self-consciousness with the notion of guest friendship and understand that it is a relational term, without which there couldn't be neither a host nor a guest, then hospitality is placed in a very different setting. I'll read the quotation for you. And with the substitution, right? He has the middle term is self-consciousness. I say the middle term is guest friendship, which splits into the extremes. And each extreme, meaning host or guest, is this exchanging of its own determinateness. The determinateness means that, in this case, that you are either a host or a guest. That's who you are, host or guest. And an absolute transition into the opposite. So you could go from host to guest and from guest to host. Each is for the other the middle term, through which each mediates itself with itself and unites with itself. So it's not just guest friendship that mediates. The extremes are also taking over the function of mediation. And each is for itself and for the other an immediate being on its own account, which at the same time is such only through this mediation. They, right, the opposites, meaning in our case host and guest, recognize themselves as mutually recognizing one another. This is the famous Hegelian quotation. The power of the Hegelian dialectic is that it turns each of the three terms into a mediating force. Both the host and the guest realize that they need each other. Neither can exist without the other, since no one is a host without the existence of a guest, and vice versa. The notion of a guest presupposes a host. What started off with a dominant position of the host is transformed into a model in which the positions of host and guest are interconvertible. The guest is as much a host as the host, and the host as much a guest as the guest. As the two players in the relationship of guest friendship recognize each other and themselves in the dynamic setting, they are transformed by the experience and realize that they're both hosting each other and are therefore both guests. For Hegel, with transformation also comes the notion of preservation. As you transform, you still maintain whatever defined you previously, and then you keep going, and with everything that determines you, you preserve whatever was there before. And in this case, we have also the two opposites, host and guest, who preserve each other. So when guests preserve, that means they guard the host, and that means they host the host, and hosts find themselves as their guests. So every position may be taken up by any element in the unity of three. Possibly this lesson too can be found in the Iliad. After 20 years of aimless wandering, Odysseus returns to his home as a guest, where Telemachus, his own son, does not recognize him. Odysseus is no more the host. Telemachus is. He honors his father, not knowing that it is his father, and defends him against the unruly suitor guests courting his mother. They were uninvited as Odysseus, but embody bad guest behavior. Odysseus, who has been a guest for 2 decades, needs first to become a guest in his home before he may again be the host. I come to my conclusion. I spoke earlier of Derrida's gold standard. It is important to realize that ancient Greeks were not always hospitable nor perfect guests, obviously not. Think about Paris, who was Menelaus' guest and stole his beautiful queen, or the guests that I just mentioned who ate Penelope and Telemachus out of house and home. However, guest friendship was an honored tradition and one of the many ways people could bring out the best of themselves and truly achieve themselves as moral subjects. This is not often recognized, that in the ancient Greek culture, being a host is a way how you achieve yourself. It's part of the arete that I mentioned earlier in the connection with Pico. In our current Western civilization, hospitality plays a minor role in the hierarchy of values. Nobody thinks, I would say, achieving themselves by being good hosts. And as a result, hospitality, guest friendship, does not contribute to stronger bonds within the fabric of society. We still use the expression to be a gracious host, but mean by it the kind of generosity extended for a limited time, usually for one evening. Hospitality is not presented as a value to strive for, not in cultural and not in religious terms. We philosophers, at least some of us, praise it in ethical terms. But that does not change anything on the ground. Children are not educated to be hospitable, which also means take a step back, and we adults are not exactly modeling it, which is the only way how children would learn about it. However, the notion of guardianship may have a better chance to be heard by correlating hospitality with it. One may hope even to reintroduce this ancient value as well. In the same way as individuals are able to extend and accept hospitality graciously, the world civilizations too ought to be both each other's hosts and guests. Great civilizations do not compete with each other. They may be emulating each other, but that's something else. Would anyone rank them? How would you do that? Does anyone rank the world's greatest composers? Mozart is not superior to Bach nor Beethoven to Handel. By the same token, civilizations do not steal each other's exploits, historical figures, or achievements. They share them. The great civilizations share them. And more importantly, they pay homage to each other. Great civilizations do not feel threatened by each other's scientific, technological, cultural, or humanitarian breakthroughs. When Henri Dunant, a Swiss, created the Red Cross in 1864, he did not think of only alleviating Europeans from hardship caused by armed conflicts and natural catastrophes. The organization was designed to be open to all signatory countries, as it is to this day. That is the measure of all inventions and discoveries, and it applies, in particular, to civilizations who know how to be both each other's hosts and each other's guests. Finally, and most importantly, great civilizations support each other. They know, or should know, that the fall of one entails the fall of others. The world cannot afford the loss of any civilization. And this is how I like to end my talk, by telling all of us, let's be each other's keepers and guardians. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tamara. There's so much there of interest. History in particular, I think that for a lot of us, we're extremely ignorant of that history. I think people are becoming increasingly aware of the role of the Islamic Golden Age in the transmission of the Greek text. But I, for one, didn't actually know there's such a direct link in that those philosophers from Plato's Academy, the last philosophers from that academy, actually went and physically moved to study in the Islamic world. We're going to have a conversation in a minute. If you'd like to take part, then I'd encourage you to put your questions in the chat, keeping the questions short and clear and within one text box if possible. Before we do that, just a very, very brief commercial break, if we may. This talk is part of a series, Expanding Horizons, and the idea is that in the English-speaking world, philosophy, which for a long time perhaps had a bit of a reputation for insularity and a lack of interest for anything outside its four cloisters, has been doing more, has been expanding. And so we're trying to both celebrate and encourage this. And I think we have a slide with some of the talks coming up here. So this is the second half of the series. The first half of the series took place before Christmas. You can watch all of those talks on our YouTube channel. This is the third of the second half, and you can see the kind of subjects coming up in the future. We've got some great speakers there: Amy Alderbing, Chike Jeffers, Lewis Gordon, Roger Ames, Janardhan Ganeri. These are really great people, and they're going to be really interesting talks. So please do come along. You can always watch them on YouTube afterwards, but we'd like to have you here to ask your questions and join our discussion. But let me kick off that discussion with you, Tamara. I want to sort of perhaps try in the conversation perhaps to just draw out a few more kind of implications of this idea of hospitality and guardianship, and perhaps see what it means in practice in a few domains. And there was one sort of contrast I sort of was thinking there. Your talk of hospitality and of guardianship, it sounded to me like it was significantly different and perhaps challenging to more dominant ideas that liberals have about the way in which different cultures interact. Ideas of multiculturalism, where we tend to talk about things like respect or tolerance, and I don't think either of those two words were in your talk. If they were, they certainly were dominant ones. Would you like to say a little bit more about how you think the approach, if this is the case, the extent to which what you're encouraging is a bit of a challenge to liberal ways of thinking about how different civilizations and cultures interact?
Sure. I'm afraid that all that talk of respect, dialogue, is in the end just lip service. It sounds good, and people may even mean it when they say these words. But I'm afraid that it is only meaningful if they're also prepared to make little sacrifices. And that usually does not happen. That was the primary reason why I moved away from dialogue, which is a wonderful word. I mean, we philosophers obviously relate to the very notion of dialogue, but it hasn't worked. I'm not saying there were no results, but it hasn't worked in terms of a profound appreciation of other civilizations, especially as I put it horizontally. It's easy to admire the ancient Persians. How about, Persians today? There is obviously a greater challenge there. And that is, of course, also true for any of the Asian cultures and civilizations today. I obviously focused on cultures and civilizations that I know best from my research. So I really see that we need something else. We need to find another way of looking at each other. And so the theory of hospitality, as it was beautifully developed by Ricoeur and Derrida, is something that I felt could find a new home, just to remain within, the terminology of hospitality. I think they too were hoping for something much larger, right, where you have indeed entire cultures meeting each other and hosting each other. But I didn't see it phrased like that. So I believe I'm adding something to their very basic ideas about hospitality. So just to answer your question in a sentence, the previous concepts that we had using dialogue and respect have exhausted themselves. We need something else, and that's just how the world develops. It's not that we necessarily falsify previous positions or previous theories or previous rules of engagement. It's just that the time comes when we should realize we could try another way of approaching each other on the world stage.
Okay, I certainly agree with that. But I'm going to sort of like, in a sense, play the role of the slightly skeptical, unpersuaded person to try and sort of like push this a little bit more, because I think perhaps some people might think that what you're suggesting sounds perhaps a little idealistic, because it suggests that we can all come together at exactly the same level, not privileging ourselves at all over others in any way. And I wonder whether that's how realistic that is, because first of all, there has to be I think that your comments recur on translation, neither to absorb nor to surrender to the other language. To have a genuine encounter between traditions, cultures, whatever it might be, there has to be a sort of acknowledgement of difference. And there also has to be an acknowledgement of kind of ignorance. So I was struck by what you said, that, you know, there's this mentality of my house, my rules, which I think you were suggesting was not kind of the right mentality. But it also struck me that that's something that a lot of people like. Your house, your rules is something that people think is very important for engaging with other people. When we go to other people, when we engage with other cultures, we try to respect as far as we can their traditions, even if they're not our own, for example. So I'm wondering, you know, to what extent aren't there, let's put it this way, certain asymmetries which are inevitable when we engage across other cultures, which sort of make that kind of idealized pure horizontal equality unattainable in some way?
I get the critical point, and it was on my mind too as I was working on this lecture. I looked at many UN documents, and I must say I was very much impressed. It does sound like a gold standard. I mean, there's beautiful plans, conferences, initiatives, and so forth. And I'm not in any way criticizing the UN. I mean, they are really working very hard to help the whole planet become a better place. But what I thought, and I'm just going back to what I said in response to your previous question, is that while the UN was once offering a gold standard, we need a new one. And the new gold standard says we are not going to be respectful of each other intermittently, which is really what we do. We have conferences, we scholars, politicians have their big international events, and usually everybody is very well behaved and very respectful of the representatives of other countries and other civilizations. But what we need is a mindset where being hospitable is part of who we are. So this is not about just throwing a nice party on occasion for people from other cultures. This is understanding all the time that this entire world is a shared place. And we're not just talking about sharing territories and resources, which we actually don't, but that will be a good step in the right direction. But more profoundly, understanding that we are all the time in each other's homes. So that is really what I was trying to address. Now, you're right about the difficulty of hosting guests who are not acting appropriately. Again, the Iliad gives you plenty of examples of bad guest behavior. And you look at the rhetoric of some right-wing groups in Europe, especially in France, and it's very much about these people are not acting properly as guests. Now, I only covered the ethics of the host and what would be the next step, and I'm planning on working that out, hopefully, is the ethics of the guest. So absolutely, the burden should not be on the host only. But you see, as you think about hospitality, the emphasis is on the host, right? Host is at the root of hospitality. So it is about the responsibility of each one of us as we are the ones welcoming or hopefully welcoming. But yes, you're right. And there is an ethics that applies to guests as well.
I also was just curious about how this should sort of play out in practice, but let's just take in the academic world and the philosophical world to begin with. You were talking about the things you think that have been well-intentioned but not quite right with the UN, and as I understand you, what you're kind of saying is that it's not enough to, as it were, throw a party every now and again. There has to be that sense of genuinely abiding with each other in a more ongoing way. And I guess that perhaps is a very good description of the kind of thing that you're doing at Hawaiʻi, your philosophy department is one in which you don't you don't have people from other traditions fly in every now and again, take them to dinner, have them a talk, and then thank them and send them packing. You have this real kind of genuinely global centre. But people talk about the fact that, wonderful though that is, that's not the only model of inquiry, and isn't it right and proper that there are other philosophy departments which are very much from within a tradition, and in those kind of philosophy departments, is it not appropriate that they engage and receive with other traditions in that more kind of throwing a party, opening the doors kind of way, rather than an ongoing way? So in other words, are you suggesting that there's one model of engagement which is permanent open doors, permanent cohabitation? That's good, but isn't there not space for other ways in which traditions maintain a bit more their own identity and independence, maybe?
Well, if you look at what permitted places to become civilizations, it's very much that they had open borders. Typically, once a civilization closes down, that's when the decline starts. My favorite philosopher for this is Simone Weil. She wrote, among other things, a play, Venice Open City. And in that play, Venice is this paradigm, and because it is on the sea, and because much of Venice's history had to do with their travelings by sea. So for Simone Weil, it becomes the model to follow. You are open to other civilizations. You become influenced, and this only happens if you are self-confident and unafraid. Once a civilization starts to be concerned about too much influence of whatever it may be, and then decides to kind of like stop something that they probably feel was just an experiment, that's very dangerous. That's when you lose your own creativity. That's when you actually end up in something like a paralysis. Another great philosopher who I find is very helpful in this respect is a 20th century Christian Arab philosopher. His name is Constantin Zurek. Constantin Zurek was all about change and openness. And he was very clear. If you shut down, then you have cultural paralysis. However, if you only open up and only find yourself as a recipient without answering, without responding creatively, without critically looking at what's coming your way, then too, you experience cultural paralysis. So that's why it was very important for me to comment there on Ricoeur and say you shouldn't absorb entirely what's coming from somewhere else or what you are hosting now in your own worldview. But also you shouldn't surrender. It is not about losing your identity. Identities thrive, being exposed to new ideas and new challenges. That has always been the way how great cultures came into this world. If you think of the Mediterranean world, I mean, all these nations and ethnicities and races in touch with each other for thousands of years, one shouldn't be surprised that Egypt was this incredible place. The Assyrians, and I could go on and on and on. I mean, the Persians, the Romans, right? I mean, all these were all the time in touch with each other. And for as long as they weren't worried about demarcation lines, borders and such, they did quite well. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, I do find that very interesting because I think, I do come across, particularly in sort of analytic philosophy, a certain idea that, whatever has happened in the past, whatever merit there may be in other traditions, the analytic philosophy is now its own domain, and that it kind of doesn't need to engage. But I guess when you look into the history of that discipline, you might say that it is only it has the strengths it has today because of a very, very long millennia history of engagement with different traditions and absorptions. And in a sense, it seems to be saying that what will keep it healthy in the future is not what made it healthy to begin with, perhaps in some way. That's just an observation you may wish to counter or not. But let's
example for that. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I can give you an example for that. I will never forget a guest speaker we had who talked about society and the beautiful things and what's missing and all of that. But it was very clear that the lecture only applied to people with an urban culture or who come from cultures and civilizations where urban centers exist. Now, you mentioned comparative philosophy several times. I happen to be a specialist for Islamic philosophy. So while I was listening, I was thinking of somebody like Ibn Khaldun, a North African philosopher. And Ibn Khaldun, for instance, developed a philosophy for the nomadic population of his native land. And when I brought up the question to this speaker, he was, and he not only was he surprised to some extent, but entirely disinclined to be engaged. That not everybody on this planet lives in cities, and we have to take into account landscape, climate, and such. Hawaii is all about islands, and so it's land and water, and you can't have the same kind of philosophy apply here as it does, for instance, in Europe or within the way how analytical philosophy sees that. So you see that's the beautiful thing about approaching, for instance, comparative philosophy. You can approach anything, but we're talking about comparative philosophy with having in mind this notion of hospitality. And the thing we do in comparative philosophy, not everybody understands this. Some people who are not in the field imagine us just doing compare and contrast. And yes, that's kind of like the preliminary work. That's how you start, right? But the idea is not about just comparing and contrasting. That's rather boring. That's just kind of like the homework that you need to do first. What we do is very much like Hegelian dialectic. I'm not sure we're always aware of that, which means we start from the middle. And the middle is typically a question, a quest, something we like to make sense of. And what we then do is pulling materials from different traditions. Sometimes it's just two, and sometimes it's more than two. And so the kind of mediation of which, for instance, Ricoeur spoke, is something that we in comparative philosophy encounter all the time. I mean, that's really our daily bread, if you will. So yeah, I wanted to add that as a comment to what you said.
That's great. I'm going to come to some questions in a minute, and please do keep them coming. I just thought I'd put up a little comment first of all, though, because it's nice to have some good comments from the audience. This is nice from David Vallejo, who says, "Merci beaucoup. Thanks very much. It's a wonderful and important discussion." It's nice to be appreciated. Thank you very much, David. But let me just turn from. So we talked about how this relates to philosophy, the philosophical world. But what about society and culture in general? This is why I suppose I'm like a little help to understand how this should apply, because as a value of hospitality, it seems that the way in which we have to manage a world in which there is much more movement of peoples and sort of cultural interactions, it seems that in those cases there are certain models which suggest that perhaps a more traditional idea of host and guest, in a way that's perhaps a bit more hierarchical, can actually work quite well, right? So, for example, in Canada, for example, Canada is often held up as a good model of a country which is very good at being a hospitable country to people who come to it. It's partly because, and I could be wrong about this, people say it's because it encourages people to join in and to become fully Canadian. It encourages them to do it, does it positively. But there is a kind of a host culture which people are supposed to kind of assimilate to in some ways. So if we're thinking socially and politically, I suppose it's a very open question, really. How do you think the way in which we manage the movements of people and the increased diversity of cultures in our nations would be different if we took this value of hospitality much more seriously?
Well, you can't force hospitality on someone, right? That is important. You can't, just to think of, let's say, one type of population going somewhere else and then expecting basically that a new home will be there for them right away. I mean, that is a forceful approach, and there is some problems with that, obviously. But you see, if you start off with the understanding that hospitality is changing both the host and the guest, then you are prepared for a type of development, your own development, and the development of the person who is within the field of hospitality. I'm afraid we are not ready for that in the West. We think, well, okay, we'll let migrants come, and they're desperate and they need a place, and we'll make sure that they have shelter, they have food, and eventually they'll have jobs and so forth. And then we typically back off, right? Kind of like, well, we've taken care of the needs here, and now people should figure out on their own a way to find a place in their new home. But you see, when you leave your original home with the understanding you'll never go back, think of people who run away from communism. These people never thought they would have a chance to return, but they are still part of that home that they have left. And you don't want to tell people that they have to eradicate anything that's reminding them, that's defining them according to where they were originally born, brought up, and so forth. We take our home with us wherever we go. We never really relinquish it, and that is something that the host has to understand. And the same way, when the guest comes, the guest may not expect that the host entirely forgets about who they are as hosts and from where they come. It's the middle. It's hospitality that allows that mediation, and it is a long process. So yes, many Western countries, I'm sure Canada is one of the best, are very concerned with providing what's needed to start. But hospitality is something much more, much larger. There is a different quality of generosity, and that's what I'm trying to get to. It's something that you should be living with and living by, a little bit just like ancient Greeks, who thought of hospitality as something that excelling in would make them better people. So you see, we are missing that specific quality right now.
Yeah, it is very interesting. I mean, I think, I'm hearing myself put these questions forward, and I'm wondering whether or not, unwittingly, I've kind of fallen for a kind of an idea of some kind of zero-sum game here. Like the Huntington Clash of Civilizations puts that in its most extreme form. But maybe we find it hard to get away from the idea that there's always a sense in which there's some kind of zero-sum game. Either the guest is going to submit to the rules of the host, or the host is going to be overcome by the mores of the guest. Whereas actually, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, what you're kind of suggesting is that no, in the best process, we don't have that sort of fear of the zero-sum game. If we and I think the Ricoeur quote again keeps coming back to me here: neither to absorb nor to surrender. The ideal is not simply to have your own way of life eradicated or taken over, nor to force the other person to take it on, but to, I guess, in the spirit of openness, see how that engagement might lead you both to change in ways that you will both appreciate, a win-win rather than a zero-sum. Is that fair?
Well, can you really meet someone not wanting to be changed by the encounter? it would be something very bizarre. Maybe some people can do that. Any encounter, any meeting, any gathering changes you. I mean, you can't read a book without being changed by it. Maybe it's just a matter of knowing more facts, but that changes you. And so we have to understand that when we meet people, from our own culture, from another culture, this is not something that we can do in an abstract way. And the more we put in that encounter of ourselves, paradoxically, the more we are in control. Because you see, you do want to understand. And as you want to understand and have questions, you also become understandable to the other person in the field of hospitality. You see, it becomes a matter of engagement rather than saying, well, this is who I am, this is who you are, what can I do for you? I remember from a very early period when I came to the United States, I was a fellow at the UCLA and extremely enthusiastic about getting to know Americans. I hadn't met many Americans until then, and I wanted to find out how they think and what makes them tick and what kind of approach they have to anything intellectual, artistic, and so forth. And so I met someone at a conference, and we exchanged phone numbers and such. And I ended up calling this person and said, "Yeah, would you like to have a coffee?" And we did meet for a coffee. And the first thing this person said, "What can I do for you?" Which now I understand is actually something very gracious. But I was a little bit hurt because I didn't want the person to do something for me, write a letter of recommendation or introduce me to someone. I just wanted to know the person. I was already back then thinking of the gifts and the beautiful things that happen in an encounter where both sides are just open and curious about each other.
Yeah, I mean, what you were saying there about how being open to change, I think one of the curious thing about human beings is that they forget how much they have changed and sort of imagine that the state they are now is the state they've always been. A silly anecdote to sort of illustrate this was many years ago, I spoke to some people who'd been pub managers, and they'd been pub managers at a pub where they'd started to do Thai food, which became a bit of a thing in the UK about a decade or so ago. And some regular customers were very upset by this, a change they didn't want. And they said, what's wrong with, traditional pub food like lasagna? And what's funny about that to me is that, they don't notice the obvious fact that lasagna was at one time, not so long ago, as new and exotic as Thai food, but they'd already started to think of it as just traditional British. Okay, I'm going to go to some audience questions because we've got a few lining up now. This one's from Sean Smith. And he says, apart from thanking you, how do we understand the ability of great civilizations to be hospitable and destructive? And I think you're talking about the same civilization in different periods. Big question. I don't know if you have an answer to that.
Sean is a colleague in the department, and I'm looking at that picture of his with a big smile, in a way telling me, "I got you." Okay, Sean, maybe not, because I was not, giving credit to the classical Islamic civilization and, for instance, the Renaissance civilization that might have really been fleshed out in unconditional ways. What I did point out there is that, as beautiful as it was an acceptance of the past. So Islamic civilization, my Muslim friends may forgive me here, was very good on the vertical axis. But when it came to horizontality, that was a very different matter. You just look at how the Islamic civilization spread from the Arabian Peninsula in an extraordinary period of time, very, very fast. I mean, it came at the expense of many civilizations. the ancient Persian civilization was destroyed, and the effort in the beginning was also to make Persians, today's Iranians, lose their language. The Arab Muslims did not succeed in that. They did succeed in making the Persians lose their alphabet, which is very sad already in itself. And so, yes, many civilizations have been destroyed in the march that the Islamic empire took in basically any direction. So in the West, it was then the destruction of the Byzantine Empire, or at least the North African territories of the Byzantine Empire, southern Spain, without getting into too many details, was also Islamicized. And then, of course, as you go east, yes, it is Central Asia, and it is through Central Asia, northern India. So that was quite a sequence of events, and they were aggressive events. So there is no question about that. But so in answer to your question, I would say what would be important to consider for the Islamic world and the rest of the great civilizations is the axis of horizontality. And that's frankly something where we are all lacking, not just the Islamic world.
One of the disadvantages of the online format is that when people ask questions, we can't sort of just ask them to clarify what they mean very, very easily. So what often happens is we take a question as a kind of a stimulus to a response, and the risk that we may have misunderstood exactly what it meant. So in that spirit, I just want to bring up this one, because it also relates to a question that I had. So this question is from Madius Savage, which is: reference is often made to human civilization as if it were a monolithic entity, and he suggests that such a conception cannot sustain your theorization of hospitality. Does civilization here mean tradition or culture? The thought that I had, which sort of relates to this, was that when you were talking about Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, in particular, his humanistic vision of philosophy as something that dwelled in all civilizations, and this the Islamic view of the philosophia perennis, there is a great emphasis there on, I guess, there in one sense being one humanity, one culture, one kind of philosophy. And I'm wondering to what extent that's compatible with an understanding of different cultures and different views. I mean, are we just using two different similar related concepts here, or what? So if you take that question and my sort of point, how do we think about human civilization as a unity, and how do we think of it as a plurality, if you want to put it in those words?
Well, yes, I understand the question. Now, I don't think that I ever said human civilization. I always used the plural, unless I was referring to one civilization in particular. So, I'm in full agreement here with this, which is the goal should not be one world, one civilization. I mean, we've heard that almost like a slogan, right? And songs have also picked up on this. That's not the idea. There was, of course, looking back, great naivete in the pursuit that Pico della Mirandola had, and not just him. There were many more in the Renaissance who had this vision, right, of tapping into everything there is, and they were convinced that at the very heart of every civilization you would find something that couldn't possibly contradict what's at the heart of another one. We don't think like that anymore. I'm afraid that when this department here in Hawaii started this incredible journey into comparative philosophy, there was a similar naivete. I read with great curiosity the first conference papers that came out of the East-West Philosophers Conference series, and there was a similar expectation that you would find something like universals. Yeah, and we look back today and we think, well, yeah, it was nice, and without diminishing the generation that started comparative philosophy, it is very clear that they were a little bit naive. But, you don't start something grand and something new without a little bit of naivete. Because if you are aware of the enormity of the task right there in the beginning, you might not even start something new. So I think that is part of what gives you the energy, that you are not really entirely aware of where you're going and what and what the pursuit entails. But so you start with the best possible intentions, and then you move on and refine. I mean, we are talking now in our department about fusion, and I am talking about bricolage, which I think is the much better model to do what it is that we do in comparative philosophy. So you see, even within one field like ours, you have different methodologies, and there are conversations about this. And it's not about entirely falsifying one and promoting another. Again, here you would have a plurality of methodologies. But the question was about, one civilization or a plurality of civilizations. My position is definitely a plurality. Why would we lose, this wealth? I mean, it's a little bit like thinking of plant species or animal species. I mean, seriously, would you now just focus on the best plant at the expense of other plants? Nobody would do that. So in the same way, every culture, every civilization is a treasure. What makes it a treasure is not necessarily that it is perfect. There is no perfect civilization. But each one of them is the expression, sometimes very elaborate expression, of a nation's or country's long journey through history. There is human experience there. There is details that you find in one culture that are impossible to detect in another. That should not be lost. So as we study this, with an open mind, with a mind of hospitality, I mean, it's obviously driven by curiosity. And as I go and do my research into, some century of the Islamic period, or also contemporary Arab philosophy, which I love to study, it's not about saying all of it is grand or all of it is valuable. Of course, on occasion, I might think, this is odd. Of course, I could be misunderstanding it, but there it's not about eliminating. So what you do is you enhance, you strengthen the best there is. According to you, you could be entirely wrong. Somebody else does that same research and finds that there are other strong points, and that's what it is. I mean, that's what it is to approach each other with in the spirit of hospitality. You do not. It's not about rejecting. It's about knowing, and what you will want to accept for yourself is one matter, and what you think the other culture, the other tradition should reject is a completely different matter. It would be entirely, unacceptable to come in with that mindset. Yeah. So yeah, I'm glad that the question came up. I did not mean to move towards one civilization, because you see, there would be no host.
Sort of the naive.
There would be no host and no guest in one civilization, right? Go ahead.
Yeah. Right. Got it. Yeah. Now I'm tempted to ask the sort of naive question, but perhaps only naive questions are sometimes good ones, about how you kind of avoid this turning into just this sort of anything goes relativism. You said, why would we want to do away with the diversity of plants and everything? Well, I guess the disanalogy there is that different. It's not that one plant is true and one plant is not true. And I think there's this image that philosophy is, at the end of the day, pursuit of truth, and that if we say let 1,000 flowers bloom, then don't we have to give up our ideas of truth? Now, I know that's a very sort of broad and simplistic question in a way, but I don't know if you have a kind of a standard answer you say to someone if you get cornered in a cocktail party or something and someone says, you comparative philosophers, you're a bunch of relativists.
Well, we do remain critical, and strengthening an idea that we find in one of the cultures that we study is pretty much a way to take a stand. We don't cover everything, and on occasion we frankly do discuss a certain system or whatever it may be that we question. Or we may have serious issues, for instance, with Western philosophy typically not talking about the family. You can do Chinese philosophy without bringing up family structure and what it does and how it should function within a Chinese worldview. So for me, that becomes a way to say, well, how come we don't give as much importance to family? But then, you go back then to a Chinese setting and you say, well, this is very nice, but for instance, what about the women? What about the second son, right? The first son is very special. How about the second son? And so what is there for them in place in that culture? People love the yin yang, and supposedly that's male and female, and how beautiful that is, and the cosmology and all of that. Now, the cosmology is definitely very, very, very attractive and inspiring, but the male and the female in the cosmology did not, bring something like an equal appreciation for women as for men, and that is something that we philosophers do address.
Yeah, it's very. It's a critical engagement. It's not about being static and just sort of treating things as though everything is set in stone. I do have another question here. Please apologise for pronunciation of names. If it's any consolation, I'm always called Bagini when it's Bagini, so I'm used to having my own name mispronounced. So Ruel Manet, apologies if I got you wrong. Now, this is an interesting question because you talked about this sort of a Hegelian lord and bondsman, sometimes called master-slave dialectic, and you have this Hegelian move, as you said, of the guest and host recognizing each other as both guest and host. And this is a question about whether this comes about every time they interact, or does it only happen as an ethical choice for the guest or host? Are you describing something that is an inevitable part of that dynamic, or does it actually require a kind of a recognition on the part of guest and host for this to happen?
It's a very good question. Yes, and it is the kind of situation of which you said that it would be great to ask back. The way I see it is that it has to be in the situation. It can be something abstract. I mean, that would be also against the Hegelian creed. It's hospitality needs to happen. You can only talk about it in the act, in the process of a host and a guest being together in the same setting. Of course, nowadays a setting could be also Zoom, right? But you need to have an interaction, and that's the only way how you can have continuous mutual determination. And the mutuality, of course, is important. Now, truly, in the Hegelian setting, where it is about the lord and the bondsman, so the bondsman is in the disadvantaged position, but the bondsman frees himself and then is enriched by it, whereas the lord is a little bit, in a problematic position. So that is not what should happen for the notion of hospitality. So this is definitely something that I like to refine. So at the end of the process, it's not about one becoming free. So like, I suppose, the guest becoming free. That would be a very terrible position to find yourself in as a guest. It means that you were actually not given hospitality. Right? So what I wanted to do is erode what Derrida in particular correctly recognized, I find, is the dominant position of the host. And so in his philosophy, there is this uncompromising expectation of what hospitality should do. But then he also says, well, this is probably not possible. So I was trying to find a way how to make it possible. And so I'm only using one facet of the Hegelian dialectic. And it's not about, one element of the triunity kind of like breaking away. That's not the way how I would like this to be understood. But yeah, Rule, thank you. Great question.
Great. Now, just to conclude, this is actually a rather cryptic comment by itself, but it invites a question I'd like you to sort of address. So, destroying Hawaiian culture. I don't know how we take that as a question because there's no subject or of the verb. But the question I've got is: you are speaking from Hawaii, which has this relationship with the United States of America, interest in its own historical culture. I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about how the position of Hawaii perhaps relates to your theme today, and how, if we were to kind of apply what you've said to Hawaii, how perhaps things may be different for there or not, or maybe should have been different in the past. I'm not sure.
Right. That's, I'm really, really glad that we can, cover this too. But, cover doesn't mean that I have big answers here. But it is something to keep in mind. We cannot talk here about studying other civilizations and not pay attention to where we live, and especially not paying attention to the history of this place, which was taken over aggressively. Hawaii was once a kingdom. It had its dynasty, it had its history, it had a language. The language is back, but there was a period in the 20th century where Native Hawaiians might have lost their own language. There is plenty of evidence from the times of the monarchy of a vital literary production in Hawaiian language. There were dozens of newspapers in Hawaii in Hawaiian language. I'm not aware that we have even one newspaper, a daily newspaper, definitely not, that is in Hawaiian language. And so everyone who came to Hawaii from somewhere else, typically from England, the United States, but more countries as well, obviously, has added to that aggressive takeover. I say this as somebody who is still a novice in this setting. I've been here long enough to know better, but I will be very frank. The department as a whole, I'm currently the chair of the department. The department as a whole is now in a process, in a very intensive process, to come to terms as to why it is that initially, when comparative philosophy was launched here, no attention was given to Hawaiian thought. And there was, I would say, not even an expectation that there might be something like Hawaiian philosophy or indigenous philosophy. So we are now starting to think about this. And I don't think that there was a deliberate effort 70 years ago or so, when we started here with comparative philosophy, to ban anything indigenous. But there was no understanding that you might very well have a philosophy, even though there are no texts. You come from a Western tradition, and also that is true for an Asian tradition. And the mark of anything that is that has to do with, let's say, wisdom, is something that is related to writing. So this is something that was not even on the horizon when comparative philosophy started here. We obviously can do better and will do better. We now have a course on Hawaiian philosophy, and we have a new series of speakers. So, if someone in the audience would like to tune in, we would love that. We have a new series of speakers on Hawaiian philosophy now. We didn't have that before. We had the occasional speaker. We had the occasional, participant in our East-West Philosophers Conference. We have edited volumes with sometimes a chapter on Hawaiian philosophy, but it was really very scattered. And we have to obviously think about how to repair this. It's a long process. The department is keenly aware that we have to change and become literally hospitable, which also means that we will be changed by the experience.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a really interesting talk, fascinating talk. We've learned a lot and gave us lots to think about, and a very rich discussion. You've been a wonderful guest. I hope we've been good hosts, and that this has been a good example of guest friendship. Thank you also to those who've tuned in. We hope you've been made to feel hospitable as well. Do remember that these talks continue most Thursdays between now and the end of March live, and as I say, we'd like you to come along to contribute your questions to enrich our discussions. But if you can't make them, you can watch them afterwards online on YouTube, along with talks from previous series. There's quite a huge catalogue there now of talks. So for this evening though, thank you for coming, and thank you of course above all to Tamara Albertini.